Hello, North Country. Welcome back for another episode of Why Waite, Innovate. My name is Matthew Waite. I'll be your host for the next hour or so. For our new listeners and viewers, welcome. Thank you for joining the North Volume media family here. We are here at episode 52 of Why Waite, Innovate, and our tag here is to highlight and amplify the voices of North Country citizens, activists, organizers, innovators working to move our region forward. We have one of those very individuals in studio today, Pastor Phil Richards. Thanks for joining us. All right, Pastor. So I think a lot of our listeners may be familiar with you. You are the pastor at the United Methodist Church on Beekman Street in Plattsburgh. That kind of makes you a de facto community leader in many ways. So before we get into the meat and potatoes and all the things that you're doing to innovate around faith, I do want to get a little bit of background. So can you inform our viewers and listeners a little bit about where you're from and what you've been up to?
Most definitely. Actually, I've been a pastor in the New York State for about 27, 28 years. Moved out here from the New England area where I grew up and, basically grew up in that area. So been gradually moving north, ended up in Plattsburgh about 7-8 years ago and having a blast out here.
Okay, so you're transplanted to the area from
Yes.
Massachusetts?
Yeah, diehard New Englander.
All right,
Yeah.
well, we won't hold that against you here, but just kidding. So yeah, it sounds like a gradual move and evolution from the East Coast up to the Adirondacks. So let's talk about high school. What were you doing in high school? Did you have any early interests, hobbies?
In high school, I went to a small high school in about in the 80s, and what I did there was I was pretty much a good student. I loved sports. I played basketball and swam. And went to a small high school, North Middlesex Regional High School, out in the Townsend Pepperell area, which was just south of Nashua, New Hampshire. And so I graduated there in '84, then went to Fitchburg State College, majored in history of all things, history poli-sci. And at that time, it was kind of fun because I really didn't know what I wanted to do in life. And so I had fun in college and actually took a semester off having too much fun in college, of all things, and went back to college, finished up my history, poli-sci, secondary ed, and then had a choice to make. And that was, I was offered a job in teaching, of all things, high school history teacher in the school that I student taught, and also was contemplating seminary. And and thinking about the call of God in my life and thinking about, what did I want to do with the rest of my life? And so weighing both options, you kind of go, okay, high school history teacher, which is awesome.
Yeah.
I loved working with kids at the time. And also following this call. And after a lot of thinking and praying, decided to go the seminary route, where I went from Fitchburg State College over to Boston University and got my MDiv, and then ended up serving churches in the Capital District on North.
Yeah, so Boston University, very, very good school. I'm sure they have an amazing program.
Yeah, School of the Prophets. Martin Luther King went to BU for seminary for his doctorate.
Name dropping already.
Exactly,
I love it.
Exactly.
All right.
And a great school for looking at the divine, looking at God in a variety of different ways, and also tying it into social justice, which is a passion of mine.
Yeah, I think we're going to get into that. I certainly hope we do. But I wanted to follow up on the call and kind of your history of faith, of religion. What kind of a household did you grow up in as far as it relates to faith and divinity?
Actually, I'm 4 generations of pastors. My mom's side first, my great-grandfather and grandfather were United Methodist pastors. My great-grandfather actually founded Goodwill. Another name drop.
Yeah, shout out name drop. I love it. Yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah, Goodwill, that's become worldwide. And my grandfather was executive director at Morgan Memorial Goodwill Industries in Boston, Massachusetts, and then switched over to my dad, who was the United Methodist pastor in the New England Conference for many years. And so religion, we sat at the table, at dinner time, and not just talked faith, but highly involved in talking politics, religion politics thing. When you talk about not wanting to avoid talking about religion and politics at the dinner table, That wasn't our family.
Yeah.
Our family, everything was put out on the table, and we had no fear in talking about it because we recognized the interconnectedness between the two.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. It was a little later on in my outline here, but historically, I think I've been told two things that you're not supposed to discuss at the dinner table, and it's politics and religion. And I think, quite frankly, that's one of the reasons that we've had. I think we'll get into this a little bit later, but I do think that we're facing some problems with both. I don't want to go as far as a crisis, but maybe it will go that far. As far as politics, I think we've got some significant issues, obviously, in religious practice. I'm sure you've been a vocal opponent to some of the things that are going on within your own church as well. And it's come up in previous conversations with guests, and one of the things that I think was most prescient about this issue is talking about trauma and issues and taboo subjects. It came up, and one of my favorite quotes is, if you can talk about it, you can manage it.
Exactly.
And I think that's one of the things that I think we've struggled with as a society for the last maybe 10, 20, 30 years, is that we have kind of made those subjects a little bit of taboo. We don't talk about politics or religion. And I think as a result, we haven't really worked through a lot of the issues, and we've kind of put it on the back burner. And I think we put it on the back burner for long enough that we're starting to smell.
I think so too. I agree with you. I completely agree with you. I think one of the things that I like to do in my own life and ministry is to recognize that when we sit at table talking with each other, and I learned that as a kid growing up, when we sit at table talking with each other, even if we disagree, the relationship sometimes trumps the disagreement. If we know each other, we can have disagreements and still be in relationship with each other. And I think oftentimes what we tend to do is we tend to compartmentalize these days. For example, I don't think it's fair to sit down at a table with only people that I agree with. I think I learn and I grow when I sit down with people from looking at an issue from a variety of different ways. And that's what I've learned not only in ministry, what I do for a living, but also I've learned, like I said, in family. I've learned in I've learned growing up. So my parents growing up, that's what they taught me. You need to sit down with the liberal, the conservative, the progressive. You need to sit down with people and hear their story and be in relationship with them, because I think then they learn and grow from you as well as you grow from them.
Yeah, no, that's very powerful, and I think well stated. It makes me think when you talk about the conversation, the dinner table, I think, a lot of people, I hear it from conservatives a lot, and I think being a progressive, I would admit this as well, that I think we are having less conversations at the dinner table. Our families are hectic. We're all busy. We get fast food. I think this, the evidence shows this more often today than we did. And I think we're losing some of those things by not having those sit-down conversations. And like you said, with different people as well. I mean, with Facebook and some of the social media, the algorithms are almost designed in a way that do kind of create these echo chambers, as they're called. It's kind of myopic, and you only see one side of the argument. And to your point, I think it's very important to listen to different perspectives and have that challenge yourself a little bit. What's happening, I think, is we're not challenging each other as much because we're talking to like-minded people, and I think as a result, our arguments become a little bit less sharp, a little bit more obtuse, and I think as a result, we're not making the progress that we need to in societal innovation. But
I agree with you. I think what happened, and I look at it as a change in our culture and society, massive changes that are going on. Look at the architecture of our homes, for example. Years ago, we used to have front porches, and so we would look out into the community. And then all of a sudden, the architecture is let's build our decks in the back, where we can be together as family. That's
fascinating. I hadn't even thought about that.
And so the front porch disappeared completely, where you would come out the front door, sit on the front porch, and you'd be talking to your neighbor. Garage doors, the remote control garage doors, where you can pull your car right into the garage, go into your home, and cocoon yourself and isolate yourself as family. And I think one of the challenges in our culture and society today is to figure out ways in which we can have conversations with each other and also create community. And that's part of what we're trying to do and what I'm trying to do in the Plattsburgh area is create opportunities for people to listen to one another, tackle controversial subjects, but also create safe space to have the conversation. Is one of the things that I do in my studies, for example, and it might drive people crazy, but I think it's so important, is we name the space right at the very beginning of our gatherings, and we name the ground rules for the conversation, that we listen to one another, that what we say to one another, we respect one another. We don't dominate the conversation, but we really try to understand where people are coming from. And no idea is crazy. No ideas are crazy. Let's imagine. Let's work together. But I think the first space is to create that safe space, because I think when people walk into conversation these days, their first question is, am I safe? Especially when you start talking about politics, faith, spirituality, religion, morality, ethics, those kinds of hot button issues. People are wondering, can I even participate? Because we tend to deal in, I don't want to say extremes, but we tend to deal in talking over each other.
Yeah, no, I mean, the quote I think is knowledge speaks, wisdom listens. And I think we've got a little bit too much, we're not doing enough listening, essentially, is I think the point that you're making. So safe spaces, I can go a number of different ways with that. But I was thinking about, to your larger point of kind of the way we even organize our society geographically, within communities. Gated communities are something that's kind of happened over the last 40, 50 years. And the wealthy, I think, are kind of showing that they're really protecting themselves. Gated communities. And you have all the fences and the walls. And obviously that has translated into other politics, which we may or may not get into. Yeah. But I think you're right to try and create a safe space, because I mean, we're having this conversation. We try not to date it too much, but I think in the last 2 years we've seen a kind of an uptick in hatred, in violence, and I think that may be what you're referencing as far as safe space. We want to make sure that places of worship are protected, and that those are the most sacred places. And so you're trying to do that, I'm guessing, with your practice and the United Methodist Church in Plattsburgh.
Yes, we are. And we're wrestling with that. How do you create open space? Because sanctuary, for example, the word sanctuary is safe space. Not just simply for worship, but sanctuary for those of the most vulnerable in our community. For example, we have the food shelf, and that meets on a weekly basis, Monday through Fridays at our building, and so we don't want to go into lockdown mode. And on Sunday mornings, we don't want to go down into lockdown mode, but we want to create that safe space where people feel okay. And so we have those important conversations. And what we've done is, for example, we've brought in mental health professionals to talk with us. We've brought in police officers to talk with us on safety and security, even within our own building, as a result of, for example, the Tree of Life Synagogue, and then what happened in New Zealand this past week. Because oftentimes the extremists seem to be going towards faith communities, of all things, to carry out the violence. And I think we have to have a larger conversation around that. And at the same time, I don't think we need to live in fear. I read a book years ago called Culture of Fear. And I'm not belittling fear in any way, shape, or form, but what I'm saying is, if you look statistically across the nation, violence is down, and yet what we're creating, sorry about that.
Yeah, no.
What we're creating is gated communities. But I think it has more to do with economics sometimes than it does with, and I think economics translates into fear, because what we tend to do is we want to protect our stuff. And I think we hear that in politics. I think we hear it in religion. And I think Jesus, my understanding of Jesus' ministry and message has something to say about that. Some of his things have talked about, when was it when I saw you thirsty? When was it that I saw you hungry? He points out those kinds of things. And so I think from a faith perspective, we have something to add to the community conversation. Actually, I know we have something to add to the community conversation.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's certainly a balancing act, and I'm sure you're doing a good job of that. Yeah, when I did previously meet with you, I saw the food shelf. You guys are doing so many amazing things to help support the community. I mean, did you want to just elaborate on a couple more before we, I guess, get into a little bit more of the meat and potatoes about United
Sure.
Methodist Church?
Yeah, I can do that. I think what we're trying to do, and what we're trying to do more and more, is a recognition that we have to engage in the community. It used to be in the 1950s, everybody was part of a church. 1950s growing up, that was the social place to be, and it was the center of community activity. There's a shift that happened probably around the 60s and 70s, where the community, and I think part of it was the blue laws came to an end. So Sunday mornings, for example, malls were open.
Okay.
Stores were open. Activities happened. People started working on Sundays, and so when the blue laws came to an end, we weren't the only act in town when it came to activities on Sunday mornings. And so the community shifted. And I think the other thing is for mainline churches, and might sound highly controversial right now.
Let's
is
do it.
We
like controversy here.
good. I think we stopped talking. We stopped talking about the issues. I think we stopped talking about them out of fear, because we were, oh my gosh, we're losing numbers. If we talk about this stuff, we're going to lose even more numbers. And so we started going into what I would call protection mode. And so what I have said, and what I firmly believe, and my mentor talked to me about this years ago, is that we need to talk. We need to engage in the issues. We need to write letters to the editor in the local papers. And when we see something that we can add to the conversation. And so what I've tried to do is create opportunities to do that. For example, the McKibben event that we had just a few weeks ago, we did that. We're having this coming fall, Liz Edmond, who wrote a book called Queer Virtue, how the LGBTQIA plus community can transform the Christian community. She's coming up to Plattsburgh from New York City to talk with us about how to create community and how to create more welcoming pieces. We're doing things like out of the Bill McKibben event, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes. We're having a full week of Earth Day festivities that was amazing. 15 people have been gathering together on Wednesday nights to plan this, and I am completely blown away by pretty much their activism, and they're wanting to say, wow, there's a community, there's a church of all places that wants to do these kinds of things, and I can kind of sit back and let them be active and kind of organize with my notes, but for the most part they're running, and I can get out of the way. And let them run with it. My adult studies, when Charlottesville happened, we did a study on racism and America's original sin. And we had 30 people in that room that wanted to talk about systemic racism in our communities and in our nation, and recognize that not all's right. When we did a course on Islamophobia, following one of the terrorist attacks, and also that last spring I did a course as a result of what was happening at the border. I did a course on community and immigration, and talked about immigration, and not afraid to talk about those things. And what I feel is what I hear from people when they come into the room and we create that open table conversation is, wow, I didn't know a church talked about these things. And so why fear? Yes, it might tee off some people in our church community, but what I'm saying is you're welcome at the table too. And we'll create safe space even if you have a different understanding. But we as a community need to figure this out together. Blue, red, whatever we want to call ourselves, Republican, Democrat, Independent, Green Party, whatever we want to call ourselves, we've got to create those open table conversations, because I firmly believe that the best of faith community is figuring it out together.
No, I mean, that was so well stated. And I think the reason why we're obviously here today is because it probably took me longer than it should have to have you on, but you're very clearly stepping up and becoming very much a leader in the community through your
Well, I appreciate that.
through your good deeds and your acts and social media. I mean, you're doing so much to help try and facilitate that conversation, and that's what North Volume is all about through our podcast. We want to have conversations. We want to collaborate. Yeah. We want to do things together. And I think your point is well stated about the fear issue. I mean, as a unabashed liberal progressive, I think one of my frustrations over the last decade or so.
I put that on Facebook. Progressive pastor living in the North Country. So my congregation knows where I'm at.
Yeah, so that's great. So even labels, sometimes labels can be divisive, but sometimes they just want to let people know, if you're comfortable with the label, where you're at and where you stand, because
Exactly.
you feel comfortable about where you stand. And I'm the same way. I feel very very confident and comfortable being a liberal progressive and saying that. And I think one of the things that's been frustrating for me in the politics, and I think there's so many overlays and intertwining issues between politics and religion. And I think I've said perhaps on the show that the way I looked at religion historically is I think it was perhaps one of the first political parties. I mean, I think politics were very much organized around religion. Very early on as we were moving from agrarian to a more civilized society, if that's what we want to call it.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Take Jesus, for instance. One of the things that I would say is, people say don't mix politics with religion. What I would say is, well, that's what Jesus did. Jesus was incredibly political. The people that I've gravitated towards in reading talk about that. We have to understand the context of first century Mediterranean life. And the reality is, for example, Jesus was living under the thumb of the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. And he was a peasant, for example, living in Nazareth. And what he was doing is, when he started talking about the kingdom of God, what I'm saying is that's political. Because when you start talking kingdom of God, who's ruling?
Yeah.
Caesar.
Exactly.
Caesar. And so he's organizing a nonviolent peasant revolution to take on Caesar. And so when you start looking at it that way, you can see that the kingdom of God was, if you will, an agenda, was a way of taking on the political powers that were organizing against the least, the last, and the lost, and the most vulnerable of society. And what I would say is that Jesus' message was incredibly political. Now, I say that, and someone's going to go, oh my gosh, did a pastor just say religion and politics intermingle? Yeah.
Shocking.
Yeah.
Breaking news here on My Way to Innovate. No, I mean, on some level, it's so obvious, but on another level, it is kind of something that isn't talked about very often. No. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation. Let's go back and let's highlight a little bit more about your evolution and your movement into the area. So you graduated from Boston University, amazing school with a great history of divinity and faith practice. How did you start? How did you cut your teeth in the pastoral world, and how does it work? Can you explain that a little bit to me?
In the United Methodist tradition, we're part of a denomination that what I am is appointed to serve in local churches. And so after seminary, I went and was approved for deacon's orders in the United Methodist Church, and then moved and appointed by our bishop to a local congregation. I started off small, like everybody else did, and that I had a 2-point charge in Niverville Chatham Center, which is in the Kinderhook area of New York. Wonderful, wonderful faith communities where we, where I learned ministry. I can remember visiting the farmers in town, as well as it was also a bedroom community for state workers. And so our church was a mixture of all sorts of people doing all sorts of different things. But it was really cool because I was able to learn ministry in Niagara Chatham Center. And then about 4 years later, the district superintendent and the bishop asked me to go to Clifton Park, where I was an associate pastor at Shenendahowa United Methodist Church for 4 years again. And during that time, my main responsibilities were in youth ministry, evangelism, congregational care. But I had a senior pastor who kind of took me under his wing and taught me about what administration was in the life of the church. And so what I did for 4 years there is, yes, I was an associate pastor in a large United Methodist church. We had 3 services on a Sunday morning. And so I was there. Then went to Newtonville for 5 years and had a great time there. And then Glens Falls for 8 years and was downtown Glens Falls for 8 years. Very progressive United Methodist Church there. Not a reconciling congregation yet, but really had a wonderful, wonderful time in the Glens Falls area. And then about 7 years ago, they asked if I would come to Plattsburgh, and when I came to Plattsburgh, I realized, because this church has a history of involvement in the community, I consider Plattsburgh United Methodist Church what I call the best kept secret in town, and that is we've been actively involved. We want to continue to be actively involved and vibrant in the community. And so I've been here about 6-7 years, and I just feel like I'm getting started here. Connecting with you, for example, I haven't done something like this in the past, and what I want to do, and I'm not doing it to get my name out, just to get my name out. What I'm doing is saying we have a faith community that wants to be relevant. We have a faith community that wants to engage. We have a faith community that wants to be active in the community. I was amazed. Do you remember the incident that happened on the SUNY Plattsburgh campus over a year ago? And we had that march. Yep. Half my congregation showed up for it. It was amazing. And so I ended up in Plattsburgh by virtue of what we call the appointment system, where I'm appointed by the bishop to serve in a particular area. I'm planning on staying for a while because I feel like we're just getting exactly. Thank you. I didn't do that, so don't tell my bishop. But
we'd love to have you here for as long as possible.
But we're having a great time.
Great, yeah. So Shenendahowa, that's a pretty big area, Clifton Park, one of the largest high schools, I think, north of the city. So what did you learn there? I mean, with something so large, that's probably what you see, because I think we're learning a lot. There's a lot of politics even in religion, right?
Yes.
You're talking about the appointments and all that stuff. It sounds like not only do you have to learn the scripture, the texts, the meaning behind it, but you're also kind of a manager in many ways, right? I mean, as you work your way up the system, you're trying to lead. Is the shepherd metaphor relevant here at all? I
think the shepherd metaphor can be relevant. I look at my role, on a day-to-day basis, I wear tons of roles.
Yeah.
And tons of hats. And what I find is that there are days when I'm at the hospital visiting, so I'm caring. And so a lot of my role is in the caring part of ministry. But then the next day, like tonight, I'm organizing Earth Day. And so community activism is another hat that I'll wear, there. And of course, the Sunday worship leader, preacher, is another hat that I wear. I'll meet with a youth group on a Sunday afternoon and have some fun with the youth there, and that's a trip in of itself, because they will not. I'm going to just say it. They will not BS you. They'll tell you like it is. And I think youth have a way of engaging and they're not afraid to talk about this stuff. I think we adults sometimes are more afraid to talk about it than the young people. And so what I'm saying, I guess, is that I wear, on a 7-day-a-week basis, I wear tons of different hats, which makes it exciting at the same time, and being, as you said, a community leader, it helps me engage and talk with people in the community. And what I have found is, which is an interesting thing, is that it used to be that pastors used to hole up in their office and used to just focus on internal stuff. I say ministry in the 21st century is going to have to shift.
More external.
And external. Community activism, being visible in the community. And
Get
it's
out
not just
there.
and it's
Engage.
not just for growth, numbers wise. We're focused on numbers, of course, because we're an organization. But what I'm seeing is a need to engage and get to know people in the community, and to listen to their wants, needs, and desires, and then create something based on what we're hearing. And so these kinds of things are the first step in doing that.
Yeah, no, very well stated. I mean, I've got a couple places I could go with that. I guess wanted to note your point about the youth and just not being shy and saying the thing, around the gun issue, which is a taboo subject to talk about up here.
Yeah.
But I think after, we had Newtown, which was horrific. I mean, I don't know if you can have a worse situation than 20
I agree. I wholeheartedly
6-year-olds murdered in cold blood. And to see the president, and the vice president rallying and not being able to do much around that was horrific. And you had a whole bunch of Newtown parents organized, and I think did some great advocacy, but they weren't able to take the football over the end line. And what I'm seeing with the Parkland shooting is it's a little bit different. You've got the kids, and they're on social media, and they're active, and they're not afraid.
They're not afraid.
And it's powerful.
Yeah, I agree. I think people want change. I really do. We just did a consultation this weekend, and we talked about all the good things that are happening in our community. And then we talked about all the things we want to work on. And one of the things the consultant pointed out was, look at the good things that you wrote down. It was 2 pages. Look at all the things you want to change. It was 8 pages. People want change. And I think, in all honesty, what happens sometimes is in those changes, people get fearful and want to go back to what I want to say is, for lack of a better word, normalcy. And so, take Newtown, take what happened in Florida, take Las Vegas, is we focus immediately on what's happening, and it's horrific, and then we create an environment in which we talk about the issues. But then when we start looking at, oh my gosh, we have to start living into those things, immediately everything dissipates and nothing happens. And I think, I really think there's a way to deal with these kinds of things, but it's going to take hard work, not only at the legislative level, not only at the governmental level. It's going to take hard work, and sometimes we do get bogged down. But I do think communities want change, and we saw that. We saw that with the students in Florida. I mean, and what's great is they're utilizing social media. They're utilizing they know their stuff, and they're organizing. And I think communities need to do a better job of organizing and then becoming more actively involved. And again, what I said before to you a couple minutes ago is we pastors, I think, stepped back and went into what I called survival mode. And we stepped back out and started focusing internally. And when you start focusing internally, it's important to care for the people within your organization or within your church or within your community, but less and less people started coming.
Right.
Young people, less and less in our Sunday schools. And so what I'm saying is, let's get out, listen to the community. Let's get out to listen to community leaders. Let's create opportunities to sit together and take on and tackle some of these issues. I can sit down with one of the most conservative people in the world, and listen, and also
agree on a lot of the things. I imagine.
Agree, yeah, and at the same time challenge each other. But we have to create a relationship there. My parents loved the TV show All in the Family. That's what we're talking about. You had Archie Bunker, you had Meathead, you had the liberal, the conservative, the moderate, and Edith. You had them all at the table, and Norman Lear did a masterful job of tackling stuff that no one else would tackle. And it's so cool to watch because you could see it played out. Do we make those television shows any longer? We get there sometimes, but I think they're happening in isolation. But I think what we can do is in our communities is make those places, make those things happen.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just recently learned a little bit more about the All in the Family, and I think you're right. I tended to think that it did a lot to help have the conversations. I mean, what's interesting is I listened to some social scientists say that they tried to study exactly what happened as a result of that, whether or not it moved the country or culture one way or the other, and they seem to think that it may not have for a couple reasons. One is I think that they found it to be, going back to our earlier point, kind of self-reinforcing. Even though the character of Archie Bunker, I think, was supposed to be a little bit over the top in a way to kind of say, okay, that's a little bit over the top. I think the conservatives said, oh, that's my guy, right? And to a certain extent kind of said, okay, like that's acceptable. Yeah. And I tend to think that there are some more social utilities, but it's hard to study and measure these things. But I tend to agree with you that we need to have those conversations, and having those conversations is something that's very healthy.
And what's great is I just learned something as well by what you said about we look at the same thing from different angles. And my truth isn't the only truth. My truth is from my experience, and what I just heard from you is a different way of looking at one thing and going, oh, that's an aha moment for me. I got to go back and look at that instead of going, oh, no, you're wrong.
Right.
You're wrong. No, let's look at that from the variety of different angles and recognize that truth our experiences come from a variety of different angles. And I'm reading a book by Barbara Brown Taylor right now called Holy Envy, and she's looking at religion and the multiple religions, and saying, each religion speaks of truth in a variety of different ways, and that's something to be valued rather than and this is coming from a Christian perspective as well. What I want to say is, this Jesus thing, this Muhammad thing, this this Buddha thing, each of them is trying to get to the vast questions of life from a different vantage point.
The Abrahamic religion as well.
Exactly. Muhammad, Islam. Everyone's trying to get to, and again, some will disagree with me on this one, but what I want to say is that we're trying to ask the important questions in life, and each tradition has attempted to answer those questions. What happens when I die? What does the good life look like? How do we care for people in our community? And each tradition has within it their attempts to answer those amazing questions. And so what I want to say is let's ask the questions and let's figure this out together.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue to something that I was hoping to get into. So philosophy and really the big ticket items, who are we? What are we trying to accomplish? All those types of things. I've been very enthralled with these types of conversations recently. Back in college, I loved philosophy, but just more recently, really have kind of picked it up again. And I watched a 4-part debate series between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, and it was fascinating to me. 8 hours worth of debate. I mean, two intellectual heavyweights going at it from two very different perspectives. And to your point about listening and learning and challenging each other, and I tend to come down on the Sam Harris side of the argument, which hopefully your followers won't.
I've read his books.
Won't think too negatively of me. But Sam Harris is very much an atheist, and his essentially his theory is that he thinks that you hate to boil it down to good bad, make it. Bifurcate this issue, but religion, good or bad, right? Like, could we do better without religion versus with religion? And that was essentially the crux of the debate between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. And I think it's so fascinating on so many different levels. And I think I've learned so much about that from both perspectives. I think Sam Harris makes some great points. And I think Jordan Peterson also comes back. And that debate and conversation is actually still happening in my head when I have other information that comes and informs that. And I think that's kind of what you're hitting on is that's what we need to do, is to have these conversations and engage in this and do it with people who think differently, who have different perspectives. And I think that's what we can see, because the way I'm going to tie it into what you're doing and follow up a little bit more with the United Methodist Church Plattsburgh is you're very much trying to build community here and to make the value of the church not just necessarily what's in the books or that thing, but really just tie that to the community and to bring the community together in a way that's meaningful. And I think ultimately that's where I can see the positive from religion. And again, historically, I actually wrote a essay in college, kind of coming on the Sam Harris side of, at that point, I was kind of questioning if religion was more of a positive externality or a negative externality. And I'm still confused and a little bit maybe in the Sam Harris guide, but Jordan Peterson and I think some of the stories and most notably the connection to community, I think is the thing that we can't lose. And that we need to make that transition in a way that's healthy for both the institution and the community. And that's very much what I'm seeing you do, and you're doing it in an innovative way. So let's bring up that for one of the first times, is you are, I think, attempting to innovate. We've talked about the social media aspect of it. Trying to do things a little bit differently because we have to.
Definitely.
I did want to touch briefly on the whole education thing, because you did mention the crime issue, and I think that for me as a criminal defense attorney to not pick up on that and make a point would have been a negligent on my end, because you're right, crime has been dropping precipitously for decades, I think since the late 80s, early
Most
90s. But at the same time, on the news media, we're watching violence all the time, right? And it happens, right? But I think there's that disconnect. There's some, we need to do a better job of educating of like, no, crime in general is down, but you're seeing crime more often, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's there. And we have to, I think, have a healthier way of looking at this.
I agree.
And I think we have to do it through education and engagement, which you're doing. But quite frankly, I think one of the things that hasn't been brought up, which I've talked about several different times, is the media. I would agree. I think the media, and that's why we're here, quite frankly, is because I think the media has kind of fallen into the traditional pitfalls of if it bleeds, it leads, sensationalism. There's an old saying that there's a liberal media and all that, and I don't tend to necessarily agree with that. I think there's a certain argument to be made, and Jordan Peterson certainly makes it, that that certain media and higher educational institutions have perhaps skewed a little bit more in the progressive way and maybe not had enough of conservatives around. And I think that's a fair conversation. I want to have that. But I think in general, what the media is biased toward isn't liberal. It's sensationalism. It's conflict.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I just am reading a book by John Dominic Crossan that talks about justice, for example. And, you talk about justice and when it comes to the criminal justice system. And what he points out is two different understandings of justice. and we tend to focus on retributive justice, which is, if someone does something, there's consequences, and so, do this is what happens. What's interestingly enough is he points out that the biblical understanding of justice actually focuses more on distributive justice, and you take it that way. You can go, okay, for example, in our penal system, why is it that we don't practice justice fairly in our culture and society? Take for instance what's happening when it comes to I've been seeing social media point this out, and community activists pointing this out. If someone take the terrorism piece, and I might get myself into trouble in this, but we'll just
fun
go there.
Trouble. You're gonna have fun trouble.
We'll just
here.
go there and see what your thoughts are. Maybe, but for example, the recent terrorist events, whether it's in New Zealand, so forth, when it happens, when the person who perpetrates these atrocities is white, we tend to deal with it differently than if it was an Islamic person or an African American person. We need to look at justice and look at how we administer justice in our communities and our societies, and I think where I'm going with that is that, as Crossan would point out, is distributive justice is much different than penal justice, retributive justice, and I think what's happened is we tend to do that, and I think what I'm saying is let's have conversations around that. Let's have serious conversations around race. Let's have serious conversations around violence, guns. You brought up guns a little while ago. As our former president Barack Obama said, we're not taking away guns. There is that Second Amendment, but I don't think the founding fathers had an understanding of the advancements in technology, for example.
Can you imagine them trying to reconcile nuclear arms within the framework of the Constitution?
I can't imagine.
I can't either.
I can't imagine.
I've spent some time trying.
But again, when we're talking Constitution, very similar to Bible. When we're talking Constitution, are we talking about it as a living document that's constantly having to be interpreted for the generation in which we live in? Now, I just outed myself by saying I'm not a strict constitutionalist.
Well, I will out myself if I hadn't already. I'm certainly with you there. I'm much more of the living, breathing document, the evolutionary document. And
the same thing with the Bible. When you mentioned Sam Harris a little while ago, I see the Bible as a living document that's constantly, for each generation, needing to be interpreted for the present generation. And so what I see it as is a living document. I love the Native American storyteller that begins each story by saying, I don't know if it happened this way, but I know it's true. We tend to literalize things. We tend to literalize Scripture. And it's fascinating the parallels between what's happening in our country with what's happening in our church. Because I tend to lean as a progressive pastor in seeing the Bible as a living document, for example. And what I want to do is to say, let's figure this out together. But again, what we have is we have those who see the Bible literally and say that, strict morality, all of those kinds of things, the five fundamentals. And I think when I read Sam Harris's The End of Faith, for example, a couple of years ago, he has valid points. He has valid points in his criticism of Christianity. But what I want to say to them as well is there's another conversation going on there. There's another conversation that I would love to engage in. So, I'm not afraid to read Sam Harris. I've read Richard Dawkins. I tend to want to read it. It's sort of like the same thing with news. You mentioned media, for example.
Absolutely, right.
I dare to flip on Fox News. We tend to silo
Right.
conversation, and I think rather than siloing conversation, and I think the news media is a marketing tool, if you will, because they have big corporations, that kind of are their money backing, and so they want to make money, and so you have MSNBC, you have Fox News, and you have CNN, and when you look at commentary, they tend to silo into political viewpoints. And even when they bring in, you say MSNBC brings in the conservative, tends to be more moderate. Fox tends to bring in the more moderate liberal. But we tend to silo conversation into viewpoints. And I think we've got to figure out a way to create, like I said, keep saying, and I might sound highly repetitive, but I think it's important, is in our local communities, that's where change can happen. And you and I can sit down together along with other community activists, as well as those who take a different approach. And let's get to know one another, the Cheers mentality. If I go back to my television shows of the 80s and 90s, where everybody knows your name, that's the thing.
Yeah, a couple things on that. One is, I thought I kind of knew what was going on, quite frankly, in the city. I had become chair of the city Democrats. Mm-hmm. I was trying to get engaged. I was doing much more social media stuff. And it wasn't until I had started a podcast that I realized I didn't know jack about what was going on around here.
Same here. I didn't know anything. I'm not going to say jack, but
I mean, yeah, I'm being a little bit overcritical of myself, but yeah, the amount of knowledge that I thought I had, which I didn't, looking back on it, is pretty incredible, and mm-hmm. specifically as it relates to our conversation. Like, I wasn't aware, and we're going to get back to the best kept secret in Plattsburgh, which is 127 Beekman Street, the United Methodist Church. I wasn't necessarily aware of what you were doing, of the church. And quite frankly, I don't think I had been in that building until Bill McKibben came, and we'll talk about that right here in short order. I did just want to make a quick note about the whole media aspect, because again, not to harp on this too much, but I do think, quite frankly, it's perhaps the most critical issue that we're facing is media, and just so Fox News, historically, I would actually go and watch Fox News just to get the other perspective. I got to be honest with you, the last 2 years or so since Trump, I don't do that because it's almost entirely propaganda.
Yeah, I agree.
And MSNBC, I think, is trending in that direction a little bit, and that's what I think is really sad. Is that to our silos issue, I think what we're seeing in the media is the same thing that you referenced with the churches. They're going into their safe spaces, their protective spaces. They're just we've got a core audience. We want to keep the core audience here. We don't want to piss any of them off.
Yeah.
So we're not going to do or say anything controversial. But at the same time, you're not really expanding the pie. You're not bringing new people in, and it's kind of a losing strategy.
And people become disengaged as a result. More and more people become disengaged when they know what they're going to hear before they even hear it. And I think you're right on that.
And to make this a little bit more personal, even as far as you talk about disengagement, I guess I'll out myself. I was raised in the Roman Catholic faith. I had First Communion, didn't go through confirmation. I kind of disengaged at about the same time that we started hearing about the pedophilia issues within the church. The church's response, I thought, was wholly inadequate, if not offensive.
Yes.
And I think what happened is I disengaged because I looked at the product that was being put out there and I said, I don't want to be a part of this. And I think, unfortunately, and I think you're perhaps seeing this a little bit too, is that because of that, people are disengaging and it's pushing people away. And, I consider myself, and right now I tend to say agnostic, because I put atheism and fundamentalism in, I don't hate, but this is dangerous, but in similar veins in so far as if you think you know for sure, you almost certainly don't. And that's why, more agnostic. But anyway,
there's a dogmatism in both. Whether it's fundamentalism or whether it's atheism, sometimes, at least on the extreme sides. I'm not saying all atheists or all fundamentalists, but what I sense is there's a dogmatism, and that is my way, and I think that's the dangerous piece when you start vilifying those who have a different viewpoint. When you start disengaging, and I think that's when people disengage, is when they hear it's my way or the highway, and I think that's the piece. I have many friends who tend to take a more literal approach to Scripture, but I'm not going to break the relationship because, oh my gosh, I can't believe this, because they could be doing the same thing to me. And what I want to say is, no, let's figure this out together. Crossan points out, for example, a fundamentalist and a more progressive person can look at the Good Samaritan story, and one can be asking the question, did this really happen? The others can say, well, this is more of a metaphor. But when you get back to the end of the Good Samaritan story, whether you're a fundamentalist or whether you're a liberal or progressive, whatever you want to call yourself, the point of the story is still the same. It's the Samaritan, it's the outsider who cared.
Yeah.
Not, who cared for the guy on the side of the road. That's the point of the story, whether it happened or not. And I was there years ago. I mean, I can remember going to Israel and a guide, the tour guide, driving up on a bus to this middle of nowhere and pulling us out of the bus and then telling us this is where the Good Samaritan story happened. And I, under my breath, I said to a friend, and if they see this, they'll probably get a kick out of it, is I said, it's a freaking parable.
Right.
It's a story.
Yeah.
Why are we talking about whether it happened here on this side of the road or not? And I say that tongue in cheek, but what I'm driving at is the meaning of the story versus.
And I think that's what Jordan Peterson is trying to do in reconciling the two. And for our listeners, that's, if you have a couple 8 hours to spare, it's a fascinating debate. But I'll just leave that there. And I did want to segue a little bit to talk about a little bit more about the church. So again, 127 Beekman Street near CVPH Medical Center. Hopefully our listeners and viewers will be a little bit more interested to hear and to see what's going on there. Because again, amazing space, beautiful. It's a beautiful, what do you call it? Just a church. Okay.
Yeah, church, right.
But there's more than that, though, because you guys have daycare and there's a lot of different facilities.
I would call it a 7-day-a-week church. With food shelf there Monday through Friday. We have, and that's the Interfaith Food Shelf, made up of the variety of religious communities in the area, all supporting this. We happen to house it, so that's an example. Head Start meets in our building. Numerous scouts on Wednesday nights. I call it Scouting Night, which probably about almost 100 kids travel through our building, pretty regularly on Wednesday nights through scouting. Numerous different other venues. Our sanctuary is used for concerts pretty regularly. We have so much happening, in our building, and like I said, I would say we have an amazing location in town for that. Plenty of parking, and trying to do amazing things.
Yeah, and you are. So I guess meat and potatoes, the weekly worships at 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. on Sundays.
Yes.
So that's probably the best way to kind of get your feet wet.
Yeah, our 8 o'clock service is more casual. It's in our chapel, a little bit smaller. I call it, doesn't have all the bells and whistles of our chancel choir and those kinds of things, but it's similar kind of format of worship. great community, and a little bit smaller. Then our main service I call it our main service is 10 o'clock on Sunday mornings, which has more. It's not necessarily more formal, but it has the choir singing, the organ, which is a fabulous instrument that when we use it, we tend to use that at 10 o'clock. And so we have those two worship opportunities each Sunday.
And you can't do it alone. Did you want to give any shout-outs to other people at the church who are helping put all this together?
We have great staff. Jeanette Woodruff, who's a teacher at Saranac, is our director of music. Steve Woodruff, her husband, is our organist. They do amazing things with the choir and the music program. Steve plays the hymns and the songs on Sunday mornings, and love working with them. We have great volunteers who just give amazing amounts of time. If I single one out, someone else is going to get mad.
I know, it was
at
a little
me.
bit of a pitfall. I want to both, allow you to kind of, tell the community what great things and great people are helping you do it, but I didn't want to,
Yeah, we have a great group of volunteers who give tirelessly of their time when it comes to giving each week. It's amazing how much they are involved, not just in the church, but involved at the senior center, involved in just organizing different things around the community, both in areas of mission, social justice, as well as care. We have people who volunteer at the hospital, on a weekly basis, and see how that is living out their call, is helping people at the hospital. We have people who are part of the community gardens, around town we have master gardeners, for example. And so we have numerous people engaged and involved, not just in church activities, of which they give amazing amounts of time and energy to. I call it their full-time job sometimes, but they're also engaged in the community as well.
Okay, so our listeners and viewers, check out www.plattsburghumc.org. So a lot of this stuff can be found there. Beautiful pictures, all the things going on. Just maybe quickly before we finish up here with a couple other different things. You mentioned the Reconciling Church. Did you want to inform our listeners exactly what that is and what that means?
Yes, yeah. A Reconciling Church is a church in the United Methodist Church that is working for inclusivity of the GLBTQIA+ community, and changing the book of discipline in our United Methodist Church in regards to human sexuality, and also gender identities as well. And it was a movement founded in the 1980s to change our United Methodist book of discipline. Our current United Methodist book of discipline, and I'm going to be perfectly honest with this, has within it a statement that was written in 1972, homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. It's also in our book of discipline, which is our law book, our rule book, if you will, has within it that United Methodist pastors can't officiate at same-sex weddings. It has within it that the church, the building, cannot be used for same-sex weddings. And we can talk about this as well for the last couple of minutes. We had a recent special session of General Conference that was wrestling with this. There were those on one side who wanted to drop the language.
This was pretty well publicized and covered in St. Louis, I believe.
Yes, and I'm one of those pastors that is working to change the book of discipline. I'm going to be perfectly frank with that. When we talk Islamophobia, I think when we're talking homophobia, I think there's a point in which Jesus speaks of inclusivity and love for all people. And so what I want to say is that our United Methodist book of discipline needs to change, needs to evolve, needs to move
innovate.
Forward and innovate. Exactly, your word. Yeah. And so a reconciling congregation is a church that is working towards that and towards the inclusive love of God for all people. And, and what's amazing to me is when I was appointed here, I was psyched because this church has been a reconciling congregation for over 27 years. And they were one of the early churches to get on board with this.
Glens Falls, where you at?
What's that?
Is Glens Falls? You said that they haven't.
They have not officially
So
become a reconciling
call them out
church.
a little bit. Come on, Glens Falls, let's do it.
Go for it. Go for it.
My wife's from down there. Great community.
And I know the current pastor, and she's awesome. And I know actually the two pastors there are both working towards the same thing. But PUMC, Plattsburgh United Methodist Church, has been engaged in this for a long, long time. The week after our special session of General Conference, where the General Conference voted what's called a traditional plan, which is pretty much to keep the exclusive language, and also make it, as Adam Hamilton talks about, is with teeth. Add more penalties if we actually do it. If we actually officiate at a wedding, if the building is actually used for a same-sex ceremony, we can get I can lose my orders.
Right, sanctioned.
And sanctioned for it. And so what many in our congregation came in that Sunday angry, grieving, couldn't believe that we couldn't even, that this had happened. And what's been amazing to me is that it's re-engaged. It's re-engaged the movement, and we're at a place right now that people want to get together and say, how can I make a difference? How can I get involved? I also think this special session of General Conference opened up the moderates in our churches to say, whoa, because as we talked about early on, most young people have moved beyond this.
I think so.
Most young people are like, you're still fighting over this? I can't believe it.
That's the thing to be optimistic about, and I talk about optimism along with this podcast quite a bit, because you're right. The youth, I don't think as far as it relates to LGBTQ, I'm sorry,
Yes.
I'm not. It changes all the time, and
does.
it's good that it does, because we want to be more inclusive.
Draws the circle wide.
Exactly. But I do think you're right. I think I very much see less homophobia, less transphobia, less Islamophobia, less racism in young kids, and I think hopefully that's what we need to be optimistic for the future. Let's just segue here quickly. I did want to obviously talk about Bill McKibben a little bit more. I'm talking about engaging in these big, profound issues, environmentalism and conservation and our beautiful world. That's something that it seems to make sense to in a religious context.
It is. And
explain that to me, and why Bill McKibben coming makes so much sense.
Well, we were talking about this in our adult study on a Monday night in January, and one of the people in the class brought up the planet. The planet's in peril. The planet, we're reaching a point of no return.
That's what the scientists say.
Which is scary. I mean, I just saw another statistic on the 5 to 9 degrees piece. We're reaching a point of no return. We can argue weather, climate kind of thing, but the science says we're in trouble. And I agree with that. And so we were talking about that on a Monday night, and we ended the class. And I said, I'm just going to go out on a whim and say, okay, I don't know if he'll be able to come. I don't know how much he costs, to come and so forth. And so I emailed him and said, would you be interested in coming to Plattsburgh? And lo and behold, he said, sure. And I almost fell off my chair at that point. And then I said, well, how much is it going to cost? And he said, what you can give. There. And so the ball started rolling, and we were originally going to do it in the summer, and then he emailed back and said, I'm going to be in the Arctic this summer. And I said, well, you need to be there.
Yeah.
You need to be there. And so what we did was, he said, how about January? And he gave the date, and I just took him up on it, because you gotta respond when someone of his caliber and expertise, and someone who can engage not just the congregation but the community in this. I just said, we're going to do it. We'll clear the calendar. We'll make sure that this is happening. And I had no expectations. I had no clue who would show. He just gave me his topic on, the global climate change and the fight, and that needs to be fought, and the activism that needs to be had, and we scheduled it. And then again, the best of social media, we started spreading the word far and wide. I think you reached out to me early on in this.
I did. I was very intrigued.
Facebook message, and that night, about 300 people from the community showed up. We had packed house in the sanctuary. I wish we would have that on Sunday mornings.
Right?
But it was amazing to me that we had packed house. And what he did, what I thought was amazing to me, was he led us through a conversation. He was blatantly honest, and he told us what was happening. But then what ended up happening is people were saying, well, I've only been gathering with 4 or 5 people here and 4 or 5 people there. And he said, get your clipboard out.
Yeah.
You got 300 people here.
That was Wendy Bridges, I think, and Patricia Blanchard. Anyway.
Yeah. You got people here. Use the networking tonight. And people did. But it began an honest conversation around climate. I think it's been happening, and we talk about it at the dinner table. My daughter, for example, won't let us get straws at any restaurant. She tells the waiter or the waitress, no straws, so that they don't even bring them back, because she knows that if you bring them to the table, you have to throw them out.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So it brought the conversations to the community, and that's what I want to do, is engage in community conversations like that, but others that people are invested in. And what I said to myself after leaving that was 300 people. I had no expectations on people. I knew people would show up. I didn't know it was going to be standing room only. And it was way cool and energizing.
It was amazing, and talk about how generous he was with his talents and everything else. He allowed us to Facebook live stream it, which I did for a little while, somewhat competently, and then toward the end showed my amateur nature of my photography.
Yeah, and it was funny because I didn't tell him this on email. He is so gracious. He walked in unassuming, he didn't come in with his entourage. He just came in. I was looking for him for
just
half
by
the
himself.
time, and then I said, oh, by the way, this gentleman, Matt Waite, wants to Facebook Live. Are you okay with that? And he said, sure. And then, Mountain Lake PBS was over on the other corner setting up, and I didn't ask him permission ahead of time, and he said, oh, because he's the same way. You might disagree with me, but let's get this conversation started and let's be active.
I think that's it. And just to try to inform our listeners, hopefully you can go back and find this because it's so powerful. But I think the reason why, basically what came across to me is just how incredibly dangerous we are getting. So you talked about the point of no return. Let's just highlight that quickly, though. We do have to wrap up here, unfortunately. I got to go back to work. But co-founder of 350.org, and 350 parts per million CO2 was what the number that they had stated was kind of the point of no return decades ago, or about when he started it. Now we're well over 400. I think we may be even close to 420 parts per million. So talk about the point of no return. You referenced the 5 to 9 degree temperature increase. Bill McKibben, I think, said something to the effect of, if the Greenland ice sheet is gone, it's something like 8 to 20 feet in sea level. Like, I got to go back and watch it, but it was so kind of hits you in the face, just like, this is so incredibly dangerous.
Well, we're talking, even in Plattsburgh, everybody's, we're walking around going, how cold a winter it is. What happened, and Bill McKibben points this out, is that the polar ice caps are melting. And so what's happening is the climate, the weather is changing and shifting. And it's not that, worldwide, the planet is heating up. Pockets are facing the same thing because of the polar melting. I'm fearful. I have kids. My wife and I talk about this all the time. Their future. We're talking drastic changes in future, and it affects not just it's beyond the climate. It affects food distribution. It'll affect our economy. It'll affect all sorts of different things. But the reality of it is, this is the one planet we have. This is it. This is it. And if we can't hand it, we have to be able to hand this off. And we're handing it off terribly. And as a result, since Industrial Revolution. And we have not come to terms with so many different things when it comes to our economy. For example, in the 1970s, I remember the gas lines. I grew up with the gas lines, during the Carter years, and we started building smaller cars. 80s roll around, we started building the SUVs again. Homes, this is the importance of conversation that I have is, one of my church members in Newtonville pointed out to me years ago, who worked for NYSERDA. He said, fascinating enough, in the 1970s and 80s, we started having better when it comes to insulation, and we started cost savings around windows and all this other stuff. But instead of looking at it as cost savings and helping with ecology and so forth, we didn't translate that. The square footage of homes went up.
Yeah.
Instead. And what I want to say is, and I think I say this for my kids, for everyone's kids, place to start is now. And we've got to start now, because we're not going to hand this off well, and it's going to end in incredible disaster. And people disagree with me on this, because I do get emails from people who disagree with me on this.
I hope you're not on Twitter.
I'm learning Twitter.
Okay.
I'm learning Twitter. Facebook is as far as I go.
I just had to get that joke in there, because Twitter is the worst as it comes to negative comments. But anyway. But
I'm scared. I'll be honest with you. I am incredibly scared right now. But fear can paralyze.
But it can
motivate. And I want to be one who's motivated, rather than cocoons myself up and goes, we can't do anything about this. Well, my theology, and I guess, as we're coming to an end now, my theology is that, when it comes to the Christian faith, there's a bent towards life. But it doesn't mean relying on God completely. We have our role as well. And I look at a cement crack in the sidewalk, and you see the green coming out of it. In the midst of man-made, there's still that life. There's that pull towards life. And so we can look at it as we're reaching a point of no return, which we are. We can look at it as in fear. But as Bill McKibben says, we need to turn our fear into action. It's a time to act, and that's going to be our Earth Day theme for Plattsburgh in April. It's now a time to act, and he galvanized that in January, and I think he motivated a whole bunch of people. Now we got to keep the momentum going.
Perfectly well stated. I love the metaphor. Change the world. Looks like you've been doing that for about 5 years now. And now Earth Day 2019, a whole week from April 22nd to the 28th. Please, I'm sure you'll put stuff on social media and Facebook.
Yes, we will. We're working on advertising tonight.
I do think we'll have to end it there, because it's been a great conversation. And obviously, as you can tell, Pastor Phil Richards, United Methodist Church of Plattsburgh, Beekman Street. If you have a chance to get down, whatever your faith is, you're going to learn something. It's going to be a great conversation, great music, just make you think about where we are in the world. And as he said, finishing with the Bill McKibben, the time to act is now. In fact, Bill McKibben was very clear that the time to act was probably a decade ago.
Yes.
And because we haven't done much of anything, we haven't really changed our lifestyle in the profound manner that we need to, that our work now is so much harder than it would have been otherwise. So anyway, it's call to action. So please check out the Facebook page, the website. Thanks so much for joining us this week, Pastor Phil. It's been a great conversation.
I've had a blast. It's been fun.
We also want to thank our listeners as well, North Volume, for their support. Of course, we would ask that you go to the North Volume website. There's actually a new app, updated, upgraded. It's very, very cool. Podcasts, web series, weblogs. Anyway, thanks so much for joining us here on Why Waite Innovate. Looking forward to everyone back for episode 53 of Why Waite Innovate, only on North Volume.